Welcome to episode 9 of Project GT6. It's a big one. Some of you may have been wondering why we've been calling this series a Restomod, when there's been plenty of resto, but hardly any mod. If you stick around till later, we'll address this. In the last episode, we reskinned the doors, cut off and welded up all the pinch seams at the back of the car, found a solution for the door-to-sill fitment issues, and removed the sides of the hood. Since the whole hood hinges from the front and extends down the sides, it actually defines the front door gap, as well as the gap along the sills and the gap all the way along the windscreen cowl. So we're going to start off today by getting the doors fitting the main body the best we can, and then we're going to have to bounce back and forth a bit to get everything else working together. We created these braces in the last episode, and their goal is to help reinforce the A-pillars and prevent any flex that leads to door movement. They need to go on next, so we'll start by removing the VIN plates in preparation for stripping down and rust converting the A-pillars. A coat of paint is applied to areas that will become captive, and after removing the paint in the plug weld holes, they can get fitted for good. To those non-colorblind viewers, yes, that's blue paint, good eye. We've also got a whack load of red paint on other areas. Do you perceive a hint of indecisiveness? Only time will tell what color the car actually ends up being. The braces have really stiffened up the doors, and coupled with new hinges, there is almost no slop anymore, even with some effort put into it, so that's great. Each door has been gone over with a ruler, hammer, and flap disc to completely straighten the lower edge and persuade the curves to better fit the shape of the sills. And speaking of which, less of our lovely new sills remain after a bit more grinding, but fear not, it's all part of the plan. As you may recall, the doors overlapped the edge here, and it was decided that the sills needed reworking due to being fitted wrong in the first place. Our plan required removal of enough material until the door eventually had a hole to fit in. Then new panels could be made to fill in the gaps left behind. It's not original, but it's the best solution we could come up with. This new panel has a bend to create a straight edge for the door to meet up to, and is screwed into place for testing purposes. Yes, we did learn our lesson. Really. With it in place, we have the start of some decent gaps going on here, and a bit of time spent with a welder and grinder can persuade the door to fit even better. You'll recall that the skins are simply bent around the door frame, so if you begin to grind the edge down, you'll break through the skin in short order. It was necessary to do, though, as we'd run out of adjustment in the hinges on this side, so it was ground a bit too far and welded back up before a final pass with a flap disc can bring it back to where it needs to be. You may have noticed that our new panel leaves a small hole at the front and back of the door jamb area. This is not an oversight. We wanted to concentrate on the majority of the fitment before filling in these areas, because as they're curved, they will require more complicated solutions. Here is the CAD template to fill in this hole, and you can see how it is going to work. The slot in it is so we can taper off the step that used to be in the sill here. We had to remove the step altogether as it was interfering with the door, and although this may make it a bit harder to seal the door from the elements later, it shouldn't have affected the strength at least. The metal version is bent up, and the transition will get a piece welded into it. With it screwed in place on this side of the car, you can really see what we're aiming for. Quite frankly, the door gaps are looking pretty good already. It's hard to get an idea of how much pain, agony, and sleepless nights these cost us, but at least we have something working now. Since both of the doors appear to be fitting close to where they need to be, it's time to turn our focus to the hood again. We've bought a couple of new heritage outer wheel well sections from England, as our old ones were past saving, and currently a few sheet metal screws are holding them together in what appears to be the right spot. Lots of test fitting will need to happen before they can get welded in for good, though. The hood itself has had the sides removed previously, and although we had test fitted the new ones, we've gone back over it with some more time and planning, and quite a few clamps, and it's really a perfect fit now. We really wish everything else went this easily. Satisfied that no other repairs are needed to make them fit properly, we'll come back to them in a bit, and first push on with some rust that needs to be dealt with. This area here was recreated out of new shiny metal, using a great technique for butt welding, where you clamp the new piece over the existing metal and cut through both at the same time, yielding a patch that fits the hole with a 1/16 inch gap for MIG welding it in. Beautiful. A similar piece was needed for the other side. Yes, it's not perfectly circular, but thankfully we can hide it under some lights eventually. Next up are some interesting little pieces to replace the ends of the two strengtheners at the back of the hood. They were bent up in the brake, beaten into submission with a hammer, and finally welded in place. The last task was to start fixing up these few puncture wounds in the hood, where some person left a tool on the engine. No, it wasn't us. No, really. All that work being done means it's now finally time to weld on the sides. We'd been waiting for this for a few months, so emotions were high as we pressed on. Lots of plug weld holes were pre-drilled, more shiny paint was applied for rust protection, red this time of course, and it can get fused into place. A spot welder would be a very useful tool to add to our arsenal someday, but until then, plug welds and a flap disc will do the trick just fine. It's fitting up magnificently, even though it may not look it right now without the wheel wells helping to hold its correct shape. So that's fantastic, and you can even tell we've made some progress on those punctures. The last step is to put some spot welds down the outside edges. This is not normal. We want to clean up all the panel seams, and although this one wasn't an external pinch seam like at the back of the car, it still leaves a line down the side of the hood that dead ends into the door for no good reason. So we're going to fill them over later. To prevent the filler from cracking though, we put spot welds every couple of inches to help keep the hood from flexing. We did briefly consider fully seam welding it, but talked ourselves out of that one just in time. The main shape is coming together, but a part that actually holds it together is this brace. It secures to both wheel wells and captive nuts on the sides of the hood. You can tell it's seen better days though, and we weren't quite sure how to repair it without losing the correct mounting points. I mean, you could create a negative jig thing, but we haven't graduated to that level of genius yet. Instead, we came up with a solution to repair and reinforce it at the same time. Gussets! 4 of these little plates were cut out and bent in our shiny and extremely well-made and expensive brake that we definitely didn't buy at Princess Auto. They fit up to the brace like so, and after welding them all in, we've got this. I see no reason why this will not have helped add some extra rigidity overall. The ends here also suffered from a bit of corrosion. There really isn't one area of the car that hasn't. And our solution again came in the form of a reinforcement. Don't worry, we're not complete dum-dums. We did drill a drain hole before welding them up. As usual, a TIG would have made for a prettier outcome, but a bit of high build primer before paint should smooth them off a bit more. With that, we're on the home stretch with the hood, but there's one more glaring area that needs some help. We explained a bit in episode 8 what we think happened here, but basically, it was maliciously attacked by a maniac wielding a hammer. It's all ruined, and the only option is to cut it out and start from fresh. We can't buy a replacement panel for the outside, but we do have a new strengthener to work up to, so that's helpful. Our cutting wheel of death was put to good use in relieving the hood from the old scrap, and some careful persuasion pulled it free. I said careful. The new strengthener fits in beautifully, so at least the hood must be roughly the right shape still. It will be a while before it can get welded in, as access to the nose will need to be sustained until the rest of it is rebuilt, but some sheet metal screws will hold it in place for now. After fixing a bit more rust, we discovered underneath where the old strengthener lived. After attempting to weld up these holes, which is never worth your time by the way, we cut it out and made a new piece like we've been doing. It turned out very nice, bar a bit more grinding in the corner with a finger sander that we didn't own yet. Lastly, these new corners can be stitched on, and once happy, some rust converter is applied, and we can finally get on with filling in that massive hole. There are only so many ways of doing this without a shrinker stretcher set, English wheel, or any other of the fancy metalworking tools. So we're going to do it the only way we know how. We'll start with a piece of steel about half the size of the hole. A single 90-degree bend is placed to provide a lip for attaching to the strengthener eventually. Next, we visually reference and mark the steel for further bending and take a few passes in the brake until it starts to follow the contour of the headlight surround. You can see how there are a few bends, each getting shallower than the previous, and together they form the curve we need to get started. The other side is a duplicate, and after welding them both together in the middle, slots are made at even increments to allow the new part to follow the compound curve of the nose. It's still rough at this stage, but it's a start. After making the slots big enough so there is no unwanted binding anywhere, we could start to tack it all together. One side was done first, and after fitting the hood to the car and playing around until we were happy with the shape, a cardboard template was made so we could mirror the shape to the other side. A shim of aluminum allowed us to tack weld the flange without accidentally attaching it to the strengthener. Lots of hammering was needed to form the patch to the rest of the hood so we could get as close as possible to a seamless join, and after alternating with hammering and welding for what felt like days, it all got welded up. The grinding disc took off the highs and the flap smoothed it out some more. We even did the underside, obviously. Next began a hammering adventure to make all our previous hammering adventures look like jaunts. There's no shortcut to this. Hammer down the highs, use a dolly to help raise the lows, and keep going over it until it's feeling better. A file was used to help scratch through some primer used as a guide coat, which makes it easier to see any lows as the paint will remain in them. It was an awful lot of work, but we really think it came out very nicely. For those wondering, yes, there are slight transitions where the bends are, and overall it still feels a bit dimply, but minimal filler will smooth it all out without much of a fuss later. These corners still need a small piece stitched in, and some careful forming accomplishes that nicely. The good old MIG joins it all, and once ground back, it's really getting hard to tell that so much work has been done here. It just looks like it's supposed to. That was a lot of work, but it takes care of the nose. So the next step will be welding all of the individual parts of the hood back together again. The wheel wells get some paint along the flanges, and everything can get clamped together for test fitting. The arms which tie together a lot of the hood are also the mounts for the hinge system. And before the hood was taken apart, we had the foresight to drill some alignment holes through the tube and brackets. Now that it's going back together, we realigned all the holes, and what we got in return was a fitment that needed quite a lot of help. After fiddling for far too long, we noticed that our expensive new wheel wells were slightly different from side to side. This is how it should fit up theoretically. The edge here lines up with the hood, and will get plug welded along here. However, with the original inside wheel well held in place by the original brace, the fitment between the two looks like this. No. The other side's even worse, with the entire plug weld holes clearly visible from this side. So, if nothing else, this should prove as a demonstration for why test fitting is so important. The glory of welding is but a small task at the end of hours of fit up. Here, the whole thing is held together with clamps and screws while we test it on the car. The original hinge mounts have vertical and horizontal adjustment in these carriers, and in a perfect world, you would expect them to mirror each other. Ours, you may note, do not. It's hard to tell, but the front right corner has had a bump at some point, which must have changed the position of the carrier. This was not evident at first, but was a relief, as it at least meant the hood was not the issue. With some adjusting, we got the panel gaps to look pretty decent. Much better than we've ever had before, because if you remember, the car was in a bit of a disarray when we bought it. There are some areas that still need tweaking, but the doors are still somewhat adjustable too, don't forget. That's why we haven't welded the sills up yet. Satisfied that we could get where we need to go, the sides of the hood could then be filled with some seam seal and crimped over like we did on the doors to finalize the join. We actually came back to this and pulled it up a bit tighter and put a spot of weld in the corner to prevent the strengthener from ever coming loose. With the latches helping to hold the hood in its final position, we can run a straight edge down the side to see if we have everything in line. Note that the reflection is looking pretty straight, and some more tweaking of the hood components should true it up even more. What is strange though is that with the straight edge held along the edge of the door, the fitment at the sill is off. It meets up fine near the door, but as you come forward, it pulls back in. We decided that it will need to be cut open and re-welded to bring it out to where it should live. One of the things I've never liked about the hood latches is how they suck the sides of the hood in when you close them. So more effort will need to be put into limiting this as well. It's the little details like this that can make a finished car feel much more thought out. The passenger side gets the same treatment, and here you can see how the sill has already been cut open to start the same kind of alterations. This side has had the two parts of our filler piece welded together and rust converted already, so all we need to do is weld it in soon. The front filler piece will come later, as it will again need some modifying, and we're going to leave the sills open as long as we can, so we can better access inside them to clean out all the dust that coats everything inside our garage. We tried our hardest to get the door gaps even all the way around, as I've seen so many GT6s with larger gaps at the front, and it just doesn't look good. We understand why it happens. The door has to clear the hood, and the hood has to clear the door, but we've achieved that while still keeping the gaps to a minimal size. It actually has a lot more clearance than it appears to on camera. It has been a ton of messing around back and forth among the doors, sills, and hood, but we are finally satisfied with how things are looking and can take the hood off to start welding it all in place. The wheel wells were welded together first, as they are really what makes everything work. We started by stitch welding from the tire side, while the hood was still mounted just to make sure everything was perfect. And now that they're removed, we can follow up and plug weld the seams. The areas that will become captive soon are prepped and given a generous coat of primer to prevent corrosion, and we can mount both sets of wheel wells back up again. The wells bolt into the cross brace here, and the tubes bolt into the hood here, so it all went back together quite easily, and after a final test fit, the wells are seam welded to the rest of the hood. And ground back, of course. The new strengthener still needs welding in, but we're going to wait for nicer weather to body fill the inside of the hood first, as it will be impossible later. It's a major milestone, as that means the hood is rust-free and basically done. Can we get a woohoo? The final step today is to weld in those filler plates for the sills. Everything captive gets a coat of primer as usual, and slowly but surely it is completely stitched together. I think it came out amazingly well considering what we had to work with. So that's great. The bodywork is mostly done, and some filler and paint should see us on our way to completion of the whole project. So let's end this video right there. Yeah. I need to tell you something. It may be a bit hard to understand after seeing today's progress, but to put it plainly, we were a bit tired of doing bodywork. Every time we go outside would feel like Groundhog Day. This waning interest seems to stem back to the sole purpose of the project. It was supposed to be for fun, but now it just felt like a duty that needed finishing. Unfortunately, a lot of us project owners can attest to this. So we began daydreaming of different ways to re-inject some enthusiasm for pressing on. Now, I was on the internet recently and I found out that time was measured differently in the 70s than it is today. People were quite happy to drive a sports car that took 10 seconds to reach highway speeds, even though today a new Corolla can do it in 8.2 and is considered slow, bro. This did help bring clarity to us though, as so far we'd been under the impression that our car was fine the way it was. But in light of this, it is in fact terrible. Well, okay, maybe not terrible, but slow. Now, I'm not a fan of people ruining priceless old cars just because they have more money than brains. But thankfully, since we have none of those, I think we'll be okay. So what we need then is a relatively inexpensive, straightforward, and quick solution to gain us a little bit more pep so we can have a hope to keep up with modern traffic. We don't know the first thing about tuning a side draft carburetor, let alone two. But we do know the donut equation of more air plus more fuel equals more power. Naturally then, we thought of forced induction. But without investing heavily into the rest of the drivetrain, we'd just rip it all to shreds. A swap would really make more sense, as the parts sold off could help another GT6 get back on the roads, and the funds received could help us buy replacement bits. So, although it will annoy any and all purist GT6 owners out there, this is the direction we're headed in. We don't want to be complete jerks about this. The car has a heritage and class that we need to respect, so we set out some rules to stick to. No modifications to the body just to make something fit. No longer, no wider, no holes. Manual transmission only. Independent suspension only. Weight distribution as close to 50-50 as possible. Turbo. They didn't exist back when this car was made, and as much as will be in Mr. Yoda's bad books for the rest of our lives, they're blackballed. The engine must be no smaller in displacement or cylinders than factory. A newer straight 6 was an obvious choice then, but unfortunately due to dual overhead cams, they're just too massive. Really. A GT6 is half a foot or more smaller than a Miata in any direction. The right V6 could work, but when I think V6, all I can see is Ford Edge, or Pontiac Aztek, or minivan. Maybe it's just due to North American stereotypes, but a V6 always just seems like the little brother to the engine you should have bought. So that's right, let the hate train commence, let America rejoice. The GT6 is getting a V8. But before you forget, let me remind you of the AC and Shelby Cobras, Sunbeam Tiger, Jensens, Morgans, TVRs, and of course the MGB GT V8, which is the little sister of what we're building. Triumph even themselves made a V8 in the Stag and the TR8. So what we're aiming for then is not a shrunken Supra, but a baby Jag F-Type. A sleek, stylish, modern version of this sweet little Grand Tourer. See you next time.